Welcome to the LBJ School of Public Affairs and to the University of Texas at Austin. Bob Hutchings, who's the Dean of the LBJ School, couldn't be here today, but he sends his regards. I'm Linda Hickey. I'm the Dean of the College of Natural Sciences here at UT, and I'm very pleased and honored to be here to introduce our speaker today, U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack. Before I continue any further, let me give you just a few nuggets about Secretary Vilsack. He's the nation's 30th Secretary of Agriculture, and during the 4 years that he's been in his position, he's worked to support farmers, ranchers, and growers, to conserve natural resources. He's helped to provide a safe, sufficient, and nutritious food supply for many Americans. He's the chair of the first ever White House Rural Council, created to focus on challenges unique to rural America. He's partnered with First Lady Michelle Obama in an effort that many of us know about, the Let's Move initiative, to really improve the health and nutrition of Americans' children. He has helped pass the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act to combat childhood hunger and obesity. He led a comprehensive effort to improve the safety of the American food supply, implementing changes to food safety standards to prevent illnesses by reducing the prevalence of E. coli, Salmonella, and Campylobacter. And as a biologist and biomedical researcher myself, this is my favorite one because I can really appreciate the seriousness of all those different types of bacteria and what they can do. Excuse me. And before he all did this, of course, he served as 2 terms as the governor of Iowa in the Iowa State Senate and as mayor of Mount Pleasant, Iowa. So quite a few accomplishments under his belt. Today, Secretary Vilsack will be talking about unlimited opportunities for homegrown energy, focusing on biofuels and their research and impact, potential impact across rural communities. As many of you know, here at UT Austin, we have several projects and programs that focus on biofuels. One of the ones that I'm most familiar with in the College of Natural Sciences is a study of the biofuel potential of switchgrass, which many of you may be familiar with. It is a species of large prairie grass that's native to Texas and much of the rest of the US. And switchgrass has been shown to have potential for biofuels and large-scale cultivation. So it's something that's in the works in this area. So today, with the Secretary's talk, we have a wonderful opportunity here to learn more about the nation's vision for biofuels and a future that relies more heavily on renewable energy. I'm very much looking forward to the Secretary's talk and pleased to welcome you here today to the LBJ School in Texas, Secretary Vilsack.
Dean, thanks very much. It's great to be here. It's great to be back in Texas, and you know, as we were sharing just before I came out here, there are a number of people at USDA who are directly connected to the LBJ School, not the least of which is Deputy Secretary Kathleen Merrigan. Her Chief of Staff and Chief Assistant, Susan Palmieri, is also a graduate of this school, and Mills, who works for USDA in DC as well. So we have a connection. And you know, I think it's also very appropriate for the Secretary of Agriculture, someone who is concerned and is focused on the rural parts of our country, to come to this particular school, named after a president who genuinely cared deeply about rural folks. That's where he came from. He understood the challenges and struggles that these folks had, and during his presidency, I think he did an extraordinary job of trying to provide assistance and help and trying to create new opportunities for folks in rural America. They were certainly under stress at that point in time, and candidly, there are several stresses today that we're dealing with at USDA and that the President's dealing with in terms of the economy and its impact on rural America. So it's appropriate I'm here. It's also appropriate I'm here because Lyndon Johnson was a great advocate for nutrition programs. He and his Secretary of Agriculture, Orville Freeman, basically established many of the nutrition programs that we currently use today to provide help and assistance to struggling families, as well as to supplement a program that Harry Truman started when he was president, our school lunch program, which we manage and operate at USDA. So there are a lot of connections and a lot of reasons for me to be here today. Let me start by defining for you the problems in rural America as I see them, and eventually I'm going to get to energy, but it will be somewhat of a circuitous route, but you'll understand why I'm going this way. First and foremost, there is still today, tragically and unfortunately, persistent poverty in rural America. Oftentimes when we speak of poverty in the United States, we have a tendency to think of it as an inner city issue, and it's often depicted that way. But in fact, if you look at this on a county-by-county basis, the 90% of the most persistently poor areas of the country are not inner city areas, but they are rural areas. So there's persistent poverty. The second issue is that so many young people grow up in small towns and in rural areas and on farms and ranches and make the decision to move away from those small towns and those farms and ranches. And as a result, we've seen a significant decline in population in rural America. 1,130 counties, more than half of the counties that are considered rural have lost population in the last census. Only 350 counties gained population. And as a result of that, we now have the lowest percentage of our total population living in rural America in the history of the country, 16%. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that as populations decline, as poverty persists, the political significance and the political capacity and the political clout of an area is compromised because fewer and fewer people are elected to Congress or to state legislative bodies that have an understanding or appreciation or a constituency that's made up primarily or a majority of folks who live in rural areas. And so sometimes the rural areas of the country don't get the kind of attention that I think, frankly, they deserve. And here's why they deserve it. If you stop and think about the importance of rural America to your lives as Americans, to our lives as Americans, regardless of where we live, obviously it's the source of most of the food that we consume in this country. 85% of all the food that's consumed by Americans is produced here in America and in rural areas. It's produced by a relatively small number of people. 85% of that 85% is produced by 0.1% of our population. Agricultural productivity is one of the great success stories in one sense in American economic history. So it's the source of our food, but it's also the source of most of the water that we consume. Most of the water that we consume, certainly the surface water, is impacted and affected by what happens on those working lands in those forested areas that are privately or publicly owned. And all of them are located in rural areas. So it's a source of food and water. If you think about our energy, regardless of what kind of energy we're talking about that's domestically produced, whether it's oil or gas or renewables, it too predominantly comes from rural areas. So it's the source of most of what helps us light our buildings and air condition our homes and the like, and to fuel our cars. And finally, even though it represents 16% of America's population, 40% of our military comes from those small towns. So it has a very high service ethic that is one of the things that's helping us maintain a strong and secure country. So it's a really important place. But it's faced with these difficult challenges. And it's faced with these challenges in the context of an economy generally in this country that has been struggling and is now in the process of recovering. The president gave a speech last night, and his speech was focused on how we as a country can get back in the business of having an economy that allows people social mobility, the ability to start out poor and end up in the middle class, to be in the middle class and end up doing even better. We've sort of, in a sense, had that social mobility stopped for a period of time, and some folks struggle to get ahead. And so he talked about three things that would perhaps move us in a better place in terms of social mobility. First of all, making sure that America is a magnet for job creation with a focus on manufacturing and clean energy. If you think about it, the American economy today is very much dependent on consumption. The more we consume, the better the economy does. When the economy gets in tough situations, we stop consuming, and it just sort of amplifies the difficulties. We need to get back in the business of making, creating, and innovating. And the president wants that to happen, and he thinks the clean energy area is one area where we can get back in the business of doing things that haven't been done before or doing them better than they've ever been done before. President also talked about the important role that this country must play in the lives of all of our children and in the lives of our young people, making sure that they are fully equipped with the knowledge and the skills to compete in a very difficult economy globally. And that obviously is a focus on education. But it also touches on the nutrition issue because we know there is a linkage between proper nutrition and school achievement and health, which is why the First Lady is so much involved in this Let's Move initiative. We have a lot of youngsters in this country that are potentially obese or at risk of being obese and will carry into adulthood chronic diseases, and it will complicate their ability to achieve. And the President talked about the need for us to actually focus our attention on these areas where there are people who are working hard, playing by the rules, but for whatever reason they just cannot get ahead. And they live in those areas of persistent poverty, and that we need to have, to use a medical term, some intensive care in those counties that have the most difficulty. Because they are persistently poor, they've lost confidence in the ability of government to be of help and assistance, and so we have to reconnect those folks with a working government. So I could talk to you tonight about our nutrition programs, and certainly that would have a link to the Johnson legacy. I could talk to you about our Strike Force initiative, which is really focused on those persistently poor areas, trying to create economic opportunity. That too would be very consistent with what President Johnson did with the war on poverty. But I'm actually here today to talk to you about this notion of being a magnet of job creation and the clean energy future. Now, to put this in the proper perspective, what is happening in rural America is that there is a new economy being created, a revival, a replenishment of opportunity, if you will. It has four components. Obviously, it starts with production agriculture and its ability to produce more than we need in this country, and therefore creates an opportunity for export. We've had four of the best export years in the history of the United States of America, and that's helped to fuel record income for many of our producers. So that's one key component, but that's always been there. Complementing that is the emergence of local and regional food systems, the fact that there are people who really want to know where their food comes from, and they're interested in going down to a farmer's market, or they want a community-supported agricultural activity, or they want a small processing facility, which is where they want their food to come from. And so we've seen a rather extraordinary increase in the last couple of years in farmers markets in these local and regional food systems, which is creating opportunities for smaller operators and those who want to take a bit of entrepreneurship and innovation on a small scale to rural areas. And then the third component is conservation, but not just conservation for the sake of maintaining our land and our water, as important as that is, but also for the sake of expanding habitat, which in turn creates opportunities for more hunting and fishing and hiking and biking, the things that people in America do outdoors. 38% of America hunts or fishes, and those who participate in outdoor recreation cumulatively spend $654 billion a year on outdoor recreation. So obviously, to the extent that you can drive some of that money, more of that money into rural areas in the form of tourism, it rolls around an economy and helps to create jobs. But the real great opportunity here is in this bio-based economy. The ability to take what we grow and what we raise in every aspect, and I mean every aspect of what we grow and raise, and be able to convert it into something more valuable. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that today. It started with biofuels. The notion that we wanted to reduce our reliance on foreign oil, and so let's figure out how we could supplement what we could produce here domestically with a bio-based fuel that would allow us to, if you will, extend or blend with regular fuel and extend that fuel supply, and in doing so create opportunities here in the United States. Today we're producing roughly 13 billion gallons, about 10% of what we use total in terms of fuel. A good portion of it is made from corn, but we've recognized that we've reached the limit, if you will, or very close to reaching the limit in terms of what we ought to be producing with corn. And so now we've begun this extensive process of trying to identify, the Dean mentioned one strategy, which is switchgrass, one of many. It's not just switchgrass, it's sugarcane, it's sorghum, it's canola, it's soy, it's straw, it's corn stover, it's trees, it's even livestock waste being used to convert into a fuel. And we at USDA are working hard to expand the supply of that biofuel. And we're doing it in a number of ways. First of all, we are setting a goal this year of helping to facilitate, if you will, or helping to support at least 10 million gallons of this advanced biofuel that's made from something other than corn, something that is using an advanced processing. So it could be switchgrass here in Texas, it could be sugar cane in Louisiana, or it could be corn stover in Iowa, it could be trees in Oregon. Using these new products and figuring out ways in which we can create fuel from them. To do that, we've made a study through the Department of Energy of how much biomass, how much of this stuff actually could we accumulate and direct towards this effort. And it's fairly clear that with the productivity of American agriculture and the land being used effectively, we could create 1 billion tons of biomass that could be converted into fuel. More than enough to reach the 36 billion gallon goal that we've set as a country, which would be roughly a quarter of our fuel supply being biofuel, with most of it being produced from these non-food feedstocks, or certainly not from corn. In order for us to identify what works best and in what area it works best, we've established 5 virtual research centers at USDA, where we combine our activities through our internal research at ARS, the Agricultural Research Service, with external opportunities in universities like the University of Texas. We work collaboratively with the private sector and the nonprofit sector and private institutions and our own research, and we exchange information. And we're trying to figure out what works, how can we make it work better. What kind of process do we use? Is it thermal? Is it biochemical? What kind of process do we use? What works best for each of the areas? Because some communities, some areas of the country are better at producing canola than others. So we want to make sure that in every part of the country, whatever could supply and be supplied as a feedstock is being utilized to create not just an industry that's focused in the Midwest or the Southwest, but an industry that's all over the United States. So we have 5 research centers. We've also worked and suggested that we would be helping farmers and landowners use their land to help grow these new feedstocks, because they may be growing corn or soybeans, and it may be difficult to convince them, with prices being what they are, to convert to something that would be better for biofuel. So we have a program called BCAP, Biocrop Assistance Program, where we actually provide assistance, financial assistance, to producers who commit a certain number of acres of land to produce a certain kind of product, a miscanthus or canola or whatever it might be, to be able to convert into a biofuel. And so we have roughly 50,000 acres of that being supported through USDA. We also are working with roughly 250 producers, including 10 that are located here in Texas, who are in the process of helping to produce these advanced biofuels, and we provide additional resources so that they in turn can lower their costs, so that they can take a risk, if you will. They can experiment with these new feedstocks to try to figure out, again, the best way to produce. It's called the Advanced Biofuel Producer Assistance Program. And we spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars supporting this effort. And we've also focused on helping to create large-scale biorefineries. We've helped to finance roughly 8 projects throughout the country. Nearly $750 million of loan guarantees and assistance we've provided to these 8 biorefineries, all of which are using different technologies and different feedstocks. The goal here is to be able to identify and create a national biofuel industry. The President last night in his speech talked about the establishment of an energy security trust fund. And what that will mean is that there are public lands that are currently being used by the private sector to produce oil and gas. And they pay the government for the use of the land and extract the oil and the gas. The President's suggesting that a portion of the proceeds from those payments be placed in a trust fund, if you will, the purpose of which would be to fund additional research so that we can learn more about this. It's fairly complicated. I mean, if you think about what kind of feedstock works and how do you convert it, and what kind of machinery do you have to harvest it, and how do you store it, and what kind of distances make sense, where the supply chain, do you need a pipeline, can you truck it, can you ship it, how do you get it, how do you dispense it, how do you do this without creating hazards to those who use it, how does it work on automobiles of various types, models, and years. All of those are research opportunities. It's a complicated process, and the President believes, and I think he's right, that we always want to continue to research. The other thing we want to do is to create market opportunities. It isn't just about relying on all of you and all of us to go out and use it in your car, but we have, as a federal government, purchasing power. And one of the largest purchasers of fuel, obviously, is the military. And the military has some very visionary leaders right now in the secretaries of the Navy, Army, and Air Force, and particularly the Secretary of Navy, Ray Mabus, former governor of Mississippi. Ray is convinced that for national security purposes, we have to wean ourselves off an over-reliance on energy supplies that come from someplace other than the United States, and that we have to do much more, rely much more on domestically produced fuels. So he has set as a goal for the Navy all of the fuel for their ships and planes, 50% of it being biofuel within the next generation. As an aside, the best press conference I think I've had in the 4 years I've been Secretary was with Secretary Mabus. He's one of the few people that could actually get a tank to a press conference with the turret facing the reporters. It's a very gentle set of questions that day. But there is an enormous market opportunity. And just last year, they had a 3-day exercise in the Pacific Theater where the Great Green Fleet used all biofuel, everything that was done, all the ships, all the helicopters, all the planes that participated, including, it was an international exercise, including those from Australia, all used biofuel. And it's a tremendous opportunity for us to expand market. So why do all this? What's the purpose of this? Well, I mean, some of it's obvious. To the extent that you can take corn stover that doesn't have a great deal of value and convert it into something that's an ingredient and something that's pretty important, it becomes valuable. It creates another income opportunity for producers. The same thing would be true for any of these other feedstocks. So it's about farm income and diversifying opportunities for farm income. It's about the environmental benefits. And studies have shown that there are definite environmental benefits with these biofuels as we've perfected the process of producing the biofuels, and they're cleaner burning fuels. They don't jeopardize the water in the same way that additives did before. They have higher octane, so they're better performing fuels. So it's farm income, it's a better fuel product, it helps to reduce greenhouse gases, and it obviously creates jobs. Today, roughly 400,000 people are employed in this industry, directly or indirectly, and when we reach the 36 billion gallon number, which we hope to be able to do over the course of hopefully the rest of my lifetime, we'll have about 1 million people employed. So it's a job creator. And it also is one of the reasons that we've seen a dramatic decline in our reliance on foreign oil. When I became Secretary, we were importing 62% of our oil in the United States. Today, I think it's below 45%, and it's dropping like a rock because of all of the domestically produced oil, gas, and the biofuels and the renewable energy. It also, as a product, also helps to create additional products. It's not just the fuel that's created from this. There's also a feed additive that's really been remarkable in terms of its content and the ability of those who feed livestock to be able to reduce significantly the corn, for example, that they would have to feed as a result of this feed additive. It basically substitutes for grain, and it's DDGs, and it's been quite successful, and it has become also a very important export opportunity. China, in particular, is very interested in purchasing a lot of these co-products. So a lot of benefits to this program, and it helps to the consumer, because studies have shown that when you basically produce biofuel it makes a difference at the pump, the price at the pump. Now, studies vary depending upon the area of the country. The lowest I've seen is a study that suggests that we save 25 cents a gallon. Think about how much fuel you consume in a year, how many gallons you consume, and multiply that by 25%. The highest I've seen is $1.39 a gallon. So it's saving consumers money, providing choice, reducing reliance on foreign oil, cleaning up the environment, creating jobs, and improving farm income. That's why this is a big deal. And it creates the impetus for us to ask the question, well, what else could we do with bioproducts? What else could we make from corn stover? What else could we make from livestock waste? What else could we do with a soybean, or or switchgrass, or woody biomass? What else could we do? Well, an obvious thing is that you can burn a lot of this stuff, and that can help produce renewable energy. And we're working on wood to energy initiatives through the Forest Service to create new energy opportunities, particularly in the western part of the country, where we have an infestation of bark beetle, in part because of forests not being maintained the way they should have been probably, and the climate changing and the temperatures getting a little bit warmer, and these beetles basically are killing millions of acres of trees. What do we do with all this wood? And you're going to see horrific fires. As we have the last couple of years, we're going to see those continue unless we figure out a way in which we can create market opportunities for this wood that's dead. Wood to energy is one opportunity. But there are also new and emerging opportunities. There are 3,100 companies in America today that are taking something from what we grow and what we raise and converting it in not just to a fuel, not just into energy, but into a chemical, into a polymer, into a fabric, a fiber, virtually everything we need. It is not unrealistic to say that today in America, everything in this room, everything you see in this room, the chairs you're sitting on, the clothes you're wearing, this platform that I'm speaking from, all of it can be bio-based. All of it. Everything. Think about the possibilities of that. Think about reducing our reliance on foreign oil to produce the plastic products that we routinely purchase. Think about a car that's plant-based. Not far-fetched to believe. Today, if you buy a Ford automobile or a Ford truck, and you get in that car and you have that new car smell and you start her up, you're sitting in a seat, the foam of which is soy-based. Today. The dashboard, the plastic, bio-based. Virginia Tech is working on technology to create an auto body made from grass material that's stronger than fiberglass, stronger than what we're currently using today, and much lighter, which will make it easier for our cars to be more fuel efficient, which will save us all money and reduce our reliance on foreign oil. I was in a facility in Wisconsin that is taking corn cobs and reformulating the molecules of the corn cobs into plastic bottles. And their goal is to create a 100% plant-based, 100% biodegradable, 100% recyclable plant bottle that will contain their water product. Now, they need a few of these every year, about 10 billion. It's a huge market opportunity. I've been at the Forest Products Lab where they are taking a look at how we could use nanotechnology and wood chips, woody biomass, wood scraps to create armor that is stronger than the armor that's being used today, but much lighter for our military and for our law enforcement. That can be the difference between life and death. If you can move just a little bit faster when somebody's shooting at you, maybe you don't get shot. It's just an extraordinary future out here. And because of the bulk of this stuff that gets converted, it's not going to be where you have one huge refinery or one huge processing facility located in one state that services the entire country or a region of the country. These bioprocessing facilities, by their nature, will be smaller, and they will be spaced across the rural landscape. They'll help to create new job opportunities that are exciting. They'll help to create new market opportunities for farm families, large and small. There's a renaissance taking place here. Now, here's why this is important, and I'll finish with this, and then I'll be glad to answer questions on this or whatever else you want to talk about, whether it's immigration or the Farm Bill or the budget. Maybe you don't want to talk about that, but this is why this is important. First of all, it allows us to proactively talk about a great opportunity in rural America to our young people. We can say without any hesitation that if you're a young person and you want to address the moral challenge of our generation, which is how we're going to feed an ever-increasing world population with scarce natural resources in a changing climate, the answer to that, in part, is in rural America. If you're a young person that's interested in climate change and you want to make a difference through conservation, the vast majority of what will be done from a conservation perspective in terms of climate change and carbon sequestration is going to be done in rural America. If you're an entrepreneur and believe that you want a direct connection with the people that you serve and they want a direct connection knowing precisely where their food comes from, a lot of that can take place and will take place in rural America. And if you want to essentially reduce the reliance on foreign oil and literally remake the American economy, remake it from something that was based on plastics and so forth to one that's bio-based and domestically created, you literally can remake the American economy, and in doing so, you create those manufacturing opportunities, those making, creating, and innovating opportunities I talked about before, which helps create a better balance in our economy between consumption and manufacturing innovation, which will help to create a larger middle class and support the social mobility that people are interested in seeing return to our economy. It's that big. And finally, it will help preserve the value system that I spoke briefly about at the beginning of this. You know, do not discount the fact that 16% of America produces roughly 40% of our military. Why is that? You might ask. You might say, well, the reason is because kids are looking for new opportunities and they want to travel, and the military is exciting and they're great ads, and it's, you know, maybe, but I think it's more than that. I think when young people grow up in rural areas, they grow up surrounded by agriculture. And as they do, they grow up surrounded by people who tend the land. And these farmers and ranchers who tend the land understand something very basic about the land, which is that you can't keep taking from it. You got to give something back. You got to replenish it from time to time. That value system is essentially anything that's important is not something you take from, it's something you give back to. And kids raised with that value system say to themselves, well, this country that gives us freedom and liberty and all of the opportunities that we have, maybe I need to give something back to it. That value system needs to remain alive and well. To do that, we have to have a vibrant economy, supporting young people who then can have their families in those small towns, know their neighbors, have that sense of service, continue to perpetuate throughout the country. That's why this is important. That's why the president's focusing his time and attention on creating this kind of economy. And why he set up a rural council, why he's got the trust fund he's proposed, why he's made a commitment to biofuels, why he's committed to renewable energy. We've doubled the amount of renewable energy produced in this country in just in the last 3 years. And he wants to double it again. All of it helping to create a vibrant economy. It's why he focuses on exports, which is job creators, why he's got the American Great Outdoors Initiative for conservation, outdoor recreation, all of it designed to create real opportunities in these rural towns. So I'm just excited about the future. Every time I come to a campus, every time I talk to somebody who is younger than me, which now is most of the United States, I am jealous because I think that the best days of this country are clearly ahead of us, despite the challenges, despite the problems that we face, because of this extraordinary new world that we're going to enter into, which is bio-based. Everything we grow, every piece of it, converted into something more valuable, saving people's lives, creating jobs, allowing folks to move up that social mobility ladder. being able to take care of their families, having their kids continue to support and serve the country. It's great. It's just tremendous. So we at USDA are committed to this, and we're committed to expanding it. We've set some very high goals. 10 million gallons of biofuel helped. We want to continue to focus on more renewable energy being produced. We want to have at least 50 companies. My USDA folks are sitting in the front row here. 50 companies, 50 bio-based companies, going to be supported by rural development this year, maybe a couple in Texas, hopefully. We want 100 new market opportunities for local and regional food systems. We want to continue to expand the record number of acres enrolled in conservation and link it more effectively to outdoor recreation. And we want to continue record exports. And if we do that, I think we'll see some addressing of the persistent poverty in rural America, and we'll hopefully begin to stem the decline of population and begin to turn it back so that folks at least have the option of living, raising, and working, living and raising their family and working in rural America. So with that, let me stop, and you know, the time we got left, I'm happy to take questions on whatever subject you all want to talk about. Great. Boy, you know, normally I have to say, well, it just takes one volunteer. It didn't take long. Good.
So for the bio-based energies we use today, specifically ethanol, are there any rules about water use or petrochemical use, fertilizers, pesticides? Can the government say we don't want your ethanol if you're going to use millions of gallons of water and if you're going to use lots of petrochemical pesticides,
you know,
or do we let them do what they want?
I don't think that there are rules of that nature, but here's what the government is doing. The government is investing with the private sector and government research in trying to figure out how to use less of all of that. And I think what you'll find is that there have been significant strides in terms of reducing water usage in ethanol production. Significant. I mean, I've been in facilities that use hardly any water at all. I was in a facility in Pennsylvania that uses reclaimed water to produce the enzyme that basically will increase significantly or decrease significantly the time it takes to produce the ethanol, all of which reduces our reliance. Now, in terms of the growing of the corn, you know, there's a lot of conservation activities going on, and this is controversial, but there's seed technologies. Some people love them, some people don't. But seed technologies that are reducing the amount of pesticides and chemicals that are being applied, and also reducing the amount of water needed to produce a crop, which is important. The point I would make on that issue of water is we had the worst drought we've had since the 1930s last year, yet we had the 8th largest corn crop in the history of the country. So, I mean, it's, even the farmers themselves were surprised at the yields. What we are trying to do, though, is to try to suggest that there is not just a single way to do farming, that we want to respect all types of farming, organic, conventional, GE, so that people who can make a decision about what's best for their operation. And we're trying to figure out ways in which we can make sure that whatever is being done on land doesn't adversely affect a neighbor's operation. There's deep concern, obviously, in the organic world about the impact of GE technology. And so we have put together a program called AC21 in which we looked at this issue of coexistence. And I think over the course of the next couple of weeks, you're going to see us roll out you know, a focus on stewardship, a focus on some mechanism to better understand gene flow, to better understand what happens in inclement weather situations, the science of making sure that contamination, if it occurs, is minimized and mitigated, and if there is indeed financial loss, that there's some mechanism for helping those producers who face financial loss because something happens to their crop that they didn't bargain for and didn't themselves produce. So that is our way of saying, look, it's not about one being right or wrong. It's our job is to make sure that if you want to be an organic producer, you can do that without interference.
Just wanted to start by thanking you for coming down to Texas and taking some time to speak with us today. I'm guessing that you probably watched Ken Burns' Dust Bowl series that came out recently.
I did, and actually I'm a little bit upset at Ken Burns because he really should do one about the Forest Service too, but he's got 10 years of projects lined up, he told me.
All right, we can lobby him a little. I was just wondering, I've traveled through West Texas a lot and have been concerned with seeing that some of the land usage patterns really leave a lot of open fields and reflect some of these black and white footage that you see of this misusage of the land. There was a lot in that documentary about what was done by some of the government programs to encourage replanting or crop rotation or different plowing techniques. And I'm just wondering if that's something that's on the horizon or if y'all are looking at, just given the level of drought that we're starting to have again.
Well, the quick answer to your question is yes. We're continually doing research on planting techniques that can do a better job of conserving soil and water and protecting the soil and protecting the water quality of rivers and streams that abut these fields. We heavily engage and involve in a number of conservation programs designed to create buffer strips to preserve the soil and conserve the water, or conserve the soil and preserve the water. We're also beginning to ask the question of how do we better utilize our agricultural lands so that we effectively and efficiently use the sunlight that we have. I think a lot of producers could be much better conservers of their soil and of their operations if they would be encouraged to double crop or multi-crop, which is not necessarily, it's rotation, but it's also potentially planting something in the late fall that is harvested in the early spring, which provides cover and creates forage potentially for the livestock industry that's suffering because we have so little forage because of the drought, and basically retaining water in the soil. We're doing a rather extensive review of this multi-cropping issue to try to determine, A, are we doing enough research to know precisely what the rotations and what the crops ought to be, depending upon the land and the region. 2, are we identifying the barriers? One barrier is, what do I do with this stuff once I grow it? Is there a market opportunity? This gets back to the bio-based economy and the ability of that grass or that cover crop to be utilized for forage, but be utilized potentially in a bioprocessing facility to produce a chemical. Part of it is insurance. The way our crop insurance program works, it has been a bit discouraging for folks to consider cover crops or multi-cropping. And so we're going to try to figure out, how do we reduce those barriers? And part of it is what is the proper balance between crop and livestock operations, and how do we basically utilize our land properly to make sure we maintain that balance. Where right now our cattle industry is struggling a little bit because of low numbers and because of high feed costs. We're trying to create more market opportunities overseas. We just recently had good news from Japan. They're going to open up their market. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the science of food. We find, and at a much different level of knowledge from country to country about what's safe and what's not. And so part of our job is to break those barriers down. So there's a lot of work and activity in this space. Part of the challenge is a budget challenge, and it's not what you might think. It isn't that, clearly you could spend an awful lot more money in conservation than we spend. But what we haven't been able to do is to align the amount of money that's available for conservation with the amount of technical expertise that's needed for that farmer or rancher to know precisely what to do. Nor have we done a good job of explaining to farmers and producers it's not just a single conservation technique that you should use, but you should understand that there are a suite of things, a group of things, a grouping of things that you should do to get maximum benefit. And if there's going to be less money, which is always an incentive, are there other more creative ways to encourage conservation or to supplement the money that we have? 2 we've identified. 1 is the notion of regulatory certainty. If I say to you as a landowner, there's the possibility that a critter that's in your area may be put on the endangered species list, that could create a lot of responsibility for you as a landowner in terms of how you use your land because of the Endangered Species Act. But if I said to you, if you do the following conservation practices on your land, I'll guarantee you, the government will guarantee you 30 years that you'll be deemed in compliance. And so if that critter actually gets put on the Endangered Species Act, you're already there. You don't need to worry about doing it. Another thing, that's what we're doing right now. We have 7 identified species. We started with sage grouse in parts of the country throughout the United States, and we think that there is this regulatory certainty idea that may be an incentive for landowners to consider strongly conservation, or if there's state water initiatives, we'd work with states. We're working with the state of Minnesota right now. So regulatory certainty. Second thing is, if we can get to a point where I can quantify the environmental value of that conservation technique, in other words, if I can measure it, if I can verify it, I can create a market. I can sell that environmental benefit to an industry that might need it. I'll give you an example. In Oregon, there's a power company that uses water to produce from a stream to produce power. When they put the water back in the stream, it's as clean as a whistle. It's not about the quality of the water, but it's a little bit warmer. The salmon don't like the warmer water. So government comes along and says, hey, got to cool the water down. That's a cooling tower. That's a multi-million-dollar proposition. Then you got to maintain it. Somebody thought, well, how about if we go to surrounding landowners along that stream and encourage them to plant trees, shade trees, naturally lowering the temperature of the water. Probably good for soil conservation and water retention, and plus it improves the landscape, the view of the landscape. Company saves a lot of money because it doesn't cost multiple millions of dollars to do that. It costs a little money, but not as much as putting a cooling tower up and maintaining it. So ecosystem markets is another way in which we're trying to figure out ways in which we can encourage conservation.
Mr. Secretary, I, like you, am really excited about the idea of our world being made out of things we grow, bios. It's really exciting to me. And what's perplexing to me is the government's stance on a certain product that today could make that stand in front of you, the clothes you're wearing, it could fuel my car, and we could eat it. And coincidentally, there's an article in the New York Times about this. A couple state legislatures have passed legislation to allow their farmers to grow it. Farmers across the country want to grow it, but the United States government isn't letting them. And this is strange because at the beginning of this country's founding, you could pay your
Is this about hemp?
It is.
Okay.
You could pay your taxes in it.
I can tell I've been told to ask this question before.
Yeah. And so I was wondering, why this government position preventing people from growing this, and when are we going to be able to do it? Because in World War II, you mandated that we grow hemp.
Right.
So and now we're prohibited from it. So I'm wondering why this changed.
And the Canadians are growing it. Well, first of all, about a year and a half ago, I was on a plane with Eric Holder, the Attorney General. And I said, Eric, we really ought to be allowed to grow hemp in this country. And he looked at me and he goes, what? And I said, well, here's the deal. It's an industrial product. It's a cash crop. It could help rural America. We really ought to be able to do that. I think that first conversation just went right over his head. Just didn't register. He's got a lot of things on his mind, right? A lot of things on his mind. Fast forward a month ago, following the referendum in Colorado, and there's one other state I think that approved, Washington. Now they're in a pickle because you've got states that have basically authorized and legalized the use of marijuana. And now Eric's team has got to figure out, what do we do about this, because we have laws on the books that say it's not legal. So you got state laws that says it is, federal laws that say it isn't. So I decided to complicate the conversation by saying, remember that conversation I had with you about hemp? It's back. And there are more and more people asking me about this. This time, he said, the first time you told me about that, I didn't pay much attention to it. But our people are actually looking at this, and they're trying to figure out. I don't know that they're necessarily going to legalize marijuana at the federal level, but they're trying to figure out how to distinguish between the two so that they can, and in doing so, allow, reach some kind of compromise with the states. So I guess it's a long way of answering that there are people in the government that are suggesting that we need to think about this differently than we've thought about it. The stumbling block is the Justice Department because of the criminal aspects of it, but we now have people thinking about how could we possibly make this happen. So I think we've made progress. We're not there yet, but I think we made progress.
Hi. The way you framed your discussion of the bioenergy issues in the United States has been couched in economic terms and for very understandable reasons. But over the longer haul, arguably, climate change itself is a bigger issue facing us. And so I wondered if you could just give us some ideas about how you and the department are thinking that the biofuel industry will contribute to mitigating climate change, offsetting greenhouse gas emissions, more details about increasing carbon sequestration. Could you just comment on those areas a little bit more?
Sure. But will you allow me to broaden the question just a little bit to beyond biofuels? At the end of, following the election, I sat down and thought about issues that we probably needed to pay more attention to and needed to have more focus on than we had had in the first 4 years. And one of them was climate change and the multi-cropping issue that I just talked about earlier. And so what we did is I brought all of the undersecretaries in my office and I said, I want you all to start thinking about how we as a department could create a more comprehensive effort on climate change. Understanding it, understanding strategies to mitigate, adapt. We need to prepare with these more intense weather conditions. We need to prepare our landowners and our producers with information and knowledge so they can make the right set of decisions to respond. I don't want to go into great detail on this today because I'm giving a major speech at the Outlook Forum, and the focus of it's going to be climate change and multi-cropping. So I don't want to lay it all out today. But I can tell you this: there is an extensive commitment to doing a lot more research and doing it in an organized, integrated, coordinated fashion. There is a belief that this cover crop, multi-cropping opportunity has sequestration possibilities. The ecosystem market stuff about measuring, being able to measure, we are trying to refine our capacity to measure carbon sequestration with certain agricultural practices. We're trying to figure out ways in which we can also do it in water so that we can have these local markets that incent investment. And so you're going to see a lot more conversation about this. You know, I don't honestly expect, and I could be wrong about this, I hope I am, but I don't expect Congress to embrace this notion at the outset. So I think it's incumbent upon places like the Department of Agriculture that have resources and where our world actually intersects with the climate. It really truly does. And it's not just the impact of a drought or a flood or a more intense hurricane or tornado. It's also the invasive species and pests and diseases that propagate, if you will, in more extreme weather conditions. I mean, there's no question, you know, we all can debate, I guess, why, but in my view, there's no question that climate's changing. And over time, over a long period of time, it's probably going to change where things are grown and what's grown. So it is incumbent, as an adaptation and mitigation strategy, it's incumbent to know what actually does a good job of sequestering carbon, what's actually going to be able to grow in certain regions of the country that may not be possible today or not likely to be done, and how do we use all of this stuff that we're going to produce in a way that maximizes and reduces our reliance on things that we know create a lot of greenhouse gases. Now, agriculture gets somewhat of a bad rap in this country on greenhouse gases because it actually, if you look at internationally, international agriculture creates a lot more greenhouse gas emissions than we do here in the United States. So I think ours is like 7%, and internationally it's like 14%. But that's partly because we are now investing in strategies to reduce greenhouse gases, with particular emphasis on anaerobic digesters in livestock operations. You know, I set as a goal we're going to invest in one a week, and we've pretty much done that. And so we now see a lot of dairy operations and even hog operations. There was an outfit in North Carolina. You know, I come from Iowa, and so I'm kind of used to hog operations. So when the staff said you're going to go to a hog farm in North Carolina, I'm going, you know, I was governor of Iowa for 8 years. I saw a lot of hogs. Okay, all right. So we pull up to this farm, and the one thing I noticed was like there was no smell. I thought, well, this is unusual. Maybe that's why I'm here. Well, it is why I was there. They had this massive anaerobic digester system that basically prevented the smell, and they used it to produce all of the electricity for the operation. And it was all, and the mechanics of it were powered, it was solar powered. So it was complete, you know, it was really a neat looking operation. And now they're producing enough that they can actually put stuff on the grid. So part of what we have to do, and part of what we're doing with our REAP program, at the Renewable Energy for America program, we've invested about 6,000 of these efficiency or renewable activities on farms, so that farmers can maybe put a windmill up, or they put a solar system up, or they do an anaerobic digester, or they do some efficiency thing that reduces their energy, and that's going to be part of it as well. So there's going to be a massive concerted effort that goes across the board, and then we're going to try to use our rural development resources, and we've got a couple of projects around the country on energy efficiency. We've got a lot of rural housing stock that's not in good shape from an energy perspective, and we're investing in energy efficiency with the RECs. So a lot of activity in this space. The person who controls the microphone is calling on these people, so this is really great because I don't have to take the grief for not calling on somebody.
So you mentioned about one of the current USDA goals right now is to increase agricultural production and to increase exports. And then I have two questions on that statement. One is the production we're talking about, are we talking about biofuel-based production mostly? And then as for the purpose of that goal, is that to increase job market mainly? Because coming from a nutritional perspective, when I think about food production, I think about food desert, which is a significant issue not only in the USA but also internationally. And then food production, to me, in comparison to food distribution, is a less significant factor to food desert.
No, when I talk about production agriculture and exports, I'm primarily talking about food products, not biofuel. We export a little biofuel, but not much. Most of our exports are in, you know, pork, chicken, beef, corn, soy, wheat, rice, things of that nature. So it's mostly food and fiber that we export around the world. We also have, you know, the United States is very understanding of our responsibility not just to export our excess, but to help others around the world be better producers themselves. So the president created the Feed the Future initiative, which is designed not just simply to export, but is designed to have us take what we know and what we know works and take it to countries where the agriculture might be quite primitive. I'll give you an example. I was in Kenya, went on a farm. It's a very small farm. It was like a quarter hectare, half hectare in size, and the farmer had one cow, and he had this little plot of land in the back of his house. And he would plant corn and soybeans the same place at the same time. So he put two seeds in the ground. And he was taught to do that. And you know, if you don't know much about crop rotation, you make the case that, well, beans come up, and the nitrogen from the beans helps to fuel the corn, and the corn comes up later, and you know, you got two crops. We tried to explain to him that if he rotated those crops, if he planted corn one year and then planted beans the next year, he would significantly increase his yields over the 2-year period. Hard for him to be convinced of that. And we said, you know, they would be so significantly increased that you'd be able to buy a second cow. And then you'd be able to milk that cow, and you'd be able to sell that milk to your friends and neighbors down the road. So and that would give you more money, and that you could buy more land, and you could grow more crops. And it just didn't compute. So we have a main challenge here, because we've got we have 7 billion people today living in this planet. In 40 years or so, 20 years or so, we'll have 8 billion, and then 9 billion, and then 10 billion. We have to increase food production by 70% by the year 2050 to be able to match food production with the number of people we expect to be on this earth. That is a huge increase in productivity. Now, in America, we've seen in my lifetime huge increases in productivity of 300% in corn and soybeans, but we're now getting to a point where the ability to substantially increase those yields, it's going to take a lot of effort to get beyond where we are today. We can do it, but it's not going to be 200 or 300% in the next 20, 30 years. It might be 25% or 50%. So America can't do it alone, and China can't do it alone. We need to have Africa. We need to, South America obviously is getting very much engaged in this and becoming extraordinarily productive. We need that kind of productivity, and it's not necessarily a risk to our agricultural opportunities, because there's just always going to be this demand. And at the same time we're meeting that demand, we're also creating this new bioeconomy that creates new opportunities. So you've got a situation where the markets should remain relatively stable. You're in charge.
So you mentioned that agricultural productivity is a great American success story, but on the other hand, given the amount that we're producing now, we also have a tremendous issue with food waste. And I think the last statistic I heard was about 34 million tons per year that are going into landfills, and only about 3% is being recycled. So within your greater energy goals, I guess my question is, how does efficiency in the food supply chain fit in with all of that?
Well, I'd say a couple of things in response to that. First of all, we've tried with our nutrition programs to talk about portion sizes and the proper balance between protein, fruits and vegetables and things of that nature with our My Plate effort. And I think that's that's beginning to work. People are recognizing that supersizing everything isn't necessarily a great idea, that a 24-ounce soda is not, may not need 24 ounces, maybe 8 ounces would be enough, right? So we are making people a bit more conscious about portion size, which hopefully will result in less waste over time. The second thing we're doing on an international area is 40% of what is produced in this world in developing countries often is lost because we don't store it right, and we don't maintain it right, and we don't keep it, safe's not the right word, we don't keep it properly. So we're trying to encourage storage, better storage internationally in these developing countries, so that we don't waste the productivity that's out there. I mean, if you could increase productivity by 40% just by having better storage facilities, that'd be a really simple way of moving towards that balance between population and food production. I mean, I think the third thing is raising the awareness level of people on food waste. When I was a kid, there wasn't such thing as food waste. You had to eat everything on your plate. Now we got a problem with eating everything on your plate. We've got too much on the plate. We have an obesity issue here. There was mention of food deserts, and that sort of ties into this, because a lot of folks live in areas where they can't access a broad array or variety of food. And so they end up mass producing a lot of stuff that at the end of the day they can't eat. Or the way in which our nutrition programs are set up, the way the nutrition program is set up now, you get a card if you're receiving help. You get a card that looks like a Visa card. And every month, at the beginning of the month, that card gets so many dollars put on it electronically. Well, the problem with that is you only get that once at the beginning of the month. It's not enough to feed your entire family for a month. So what happens is people go to the grocery store, they use all of their capacity up that second day of the month. And if you're buying any kind of fresh fruit and vegetable, it's not going to last for 30 days. So people end up either not buying it or throwing out the product that's wasted. So we're looking at ways in which we might be able to structure those payments, that card, differently, that would encourage. And we're also trying to figure out ways in which we can address this food desert issue by using our resources to encourage smaller scale grocery stores, but providing enough of a choice more than a convenience store. We're working with grocers across the country to raise their awareness that they have some responsibility for putting grocery stores in some of these desert areas. The best example I can use is Whole Foods. Whole Foods went to Detroit, and you know the notion of a Whole Foods in inner city Detroit is sort of counterintuitive. But I know the CEO of Whole Foods, and I said, you know, you got some moral responsibility here. You really should talk to the African American ministers who are ministering to these people, and they'll tell you what life is like without a grocery store. So to his credit, he went, listened, sent the team to Detroit. The team came back and said, you know, our system won't work there. You know, it's just too expensive. And to his credit, he said, well, change the system. Figure out how to make it work. Well, the way you make it work is that you first of all survey the people in the community and find out what they want. So you're only selling things that they want. You're not selling a whole bunch of stuff that nobody knows what to do with. And then secondly, operate the store at no profit. Don't lose money, but don't make money. It's better than handing the community a check, which is what a lot of corporations do. Now you've got a functioning, job-creating operation in the community. Because you're not operating at a profit, that helps you lower the price of things to the point where it's reasonably priced, and you're structuring it in such a way that it's only selling people what they want to buy to begin with. But it's fresh fruits, it's vegetables, it's greater diversity, and maybe in doing so you also do a little education, which is what Whole Foods does. They do a lot of education in terms of recipes and that kind of thing. So that is going on. And at the same time that's going on, we're working, and this has been a struggle, but we're working, and I think we're creating greater flexibility in our school lunch and school breakfast programs. And the portion sizes there, I think, are encouraging the next generation of young people to basically do a better job of figuring out precisely how many calories they need during a day and what's too much of or not enough. So there's a lot going on in that space as well.
So this is the last question.
Oh, it is? Oh,
Yes.
Okay. I may not put you in charge of that. I may answer another question or two. We'll see. Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for coming to Texas. We really appreciate it. I'm Wes Sims. I'm president of Texas Farmers Union. I might be the only farmer here. But I would like to make two statements, real short, and then I got a question for you. First off, I heard the snickers and the laughs about the hemp. Well, in Texas Farmers Union, we have supported being able to farm hemp since, say, in 1946, they outlawed it. If it's such a good cannabis, then how come they don't smuggle it in? The real truth is, I understand that, you know, Europe's going to, by the EU, by 2015, they will be building all of their industrial buildings out of hemp, which can be smoother than plastic and stronger than steel. And the industrial hemp, they've genetically modified the seeds to where they can take the cannabis out, which is a very small amount and very poor quality to start with, is my understanding. But, and then water. I'm from part of the state. My farm and ranching operation's always been 270 miles northwest of here. My state office in Waco, so I only traveled 100 miles. But tonight and early in the morning, my wife and I traveled the 270 back to her home. But we have not had runoff water since August of '08. And Austin down here is feeling the effect because the Colorado headwaters almost at New Mexico. And none of the west here is just not getting runoff, so their lakes are in terrible condition. I've seen all 7 of them. In my opinion, it's a state problem, but we're going to have outside water. These cities are growing by literally the millions. and we're going to have water. And I have irrigation as well as dry land. The Okalala's, it's rapidly depleting. That's not going to stop. Maybe we're under a new norm. We're going to have to learn to do things different on water. That's my two statements. My question, in my county, we have approximately 2,000 of the big windmills, the wind farms. Now, those are basically owned by very large corporations for one purpose, tax credits. Now, our wind energy thing, and we're not losing any wind. It don't go to waste. It just keeps on moving. So we can keep building. But we got two problems. One of them is the grid, having enough grid to move what we can already produce. But we need to continue to develop our wind energy, even though it's not being developed like in Farmers Union 30 years ago when we started working on that. We had hoped that rural communities and landowners would own them. That's not the way it worked out. So the dollars could have been the same, my opinion. But we went the other way, and it's good for rural America. It's wonderful for rural Texas, especially in the western part of the state where we have so much wind. But without the tax credits, which is the primary interest of the big corporations that build the wind farms, without them, there's just nothing happening. And number one, we got to have grid. Number two, we got to have the tax credit to stimulate. And then I guess and the end of that question is when their tax credits is up after 10 years, and they've used up their tax credits. A lot of us farmers and ranchers, we're really worried about what then will happen to our wind energy. And I don't know whether you want to address that. But those two things.
Well,
are we going to get wind credits again?
Yeah. First of all, you got a good point about the grid, and there needs to be a process in which we create enough activity on transmission lines that the wind that's being produced gets to where it needs to go. Right now, in many parts of the country, wind is being produced, but then there's not much expansion because there's no place to put it, even though there are cities that could use it, but there's no place to get it to the city to use it. That's why the President asked cabinet secretaries who are involved in transmission issues, the Energy Department, the Interior Department, the Forest Service, EPA, to come together to see if there's a way in which we could significantly, and FERC, to significantly reduce the amount of time it takes to approve transmission lines. It's unbelievably long, and it's unconscionable in this day and age. When we started this process, the average was, I think, 7 to 8 years. I think we have it down significantly below that, and we certainly have figured out a way to do it on public lands in a smart way, more efficiently. The second issue is making sure that if you have the capacity, if you have a windmill on your farm that you do in fact own, that you can work with the utility company to net meter, to put power on the grid, and that you get the benefit of any excess that you don't use for your own operation. And that's a state-by-state issue. But I think more and more of that's going to happen as wind becomes more and more of our renewable portfolio. The President challenged us last night to double the amount of renewable energy by 2020. We doubled it in 3 years this time around. So I don't, at least from his vision, and I agree with him, I don't think the wind energy is going away. The key here obviously will be to make sure that at some point in time it becomes self-sustaining. That, you know, credits can't last forever, but they do need to last long enough for these fledgling industries to get their sea legs and to be able to compete effectively based on efficiencies. Windmills are becoming much more efficient. And there's actually some pretty interesting research now on windmills that don't have the big blades, but they're actually inside the whatever that's called. I'm going to call it a tunnel. It's not a tunnel. It's whatever the big tower. Thank you. It's inside the tower, and somehow by putting the blades inside the tower, you can actually potentially save some of the electricity that's produced. Right now with wind, you know, if the wind's not blowing, you're out of luck, and if it's blowing real fast, you can't save some of that for a more difficult day. So all that's going on. You know, I think that we will also, as a country, and this is back to a question about efficiency, we're also going to be a country that's going to learn how to use electricity more efficiently. We have food waste, we also have utility waste. And to the extent that we have smart metering, we have appliances that are modernized to be able to utilize less energy, that we figure out that, you know, if we use our washer and dryer at 10 o'clock at night instead of 6 o'clock in the morning, you know, it's less expensive. There's going to be a lot of activity in that space, I think, that's going to make us better consumers of electricity and of power. But there's no question we're going to need more of it because our country is going to continue to expand in terms of population, and these cities, you mentioned, these cities are going to continue to expand. I'm worried about that. That's one of the reasons why I think it'd be helpful if we had rural communities that were stronger and more viable. We've got all that housing stock, we've got all that infrastructure, we've got schools, we've got hospitals, all of which was built some time ago, but still functional. But if we keep seeing this shift of population to urban centers, what are you going to do with all those rural areas? And eventually it'll get to a point where the folks who live in those small towns won't have any of the tools that they need to succeed. And we're seeing this already in broadband. You know, President Johnson was obviously very committed and understood the power of RECs and rural electrification. It's something he committed himself to, and it's something he worked on. And somebody the other day said, well, you know, why can't the broadband be just like the RECs? So there's a big difference. You know, what's that? I said, well, when the RECs were created, rural America could elect or fire a president by itself. Can't do that now. It has to have help. And that's when I say that the political relevance of rural America is diminished because of population. That's what I mean. I mean, we couldn't even get a farm bill through this last year. And the Senate passes one, the House Ag Committee passes one, the Speaker of the House decides he doesn't want it. He was able to do that without any political ramification whatsoever. And I think that's a wake-up call. And I think it's a wake-up call for rural folks. I think that there has to be a much better effort on the part of agriculture to communicate not just to itself but to others outside of the 1/10 of 1% of the people that produce most of what we consume. I think there has to be a conversation about agriculture and what agriculture is and what it does and the importance of it and the important role it plays in all of our lives as a food secure nation. That doesn't happen very often. I mean, I appreciate the Dodge ad. That was great. But we need to do more of that kind of thing. We need to constructively engage conversation. You know, we have a tendency to be defensive. When people suggest a different way of doing something, we sort of hunker down and become defensive. The problem with that is those issues are not going away. We need to engage people in dialogue. And that's what we did with the organic and the GE communities. We said, look, you guys can fight each other, but you're not big. Neither one of you are big enough in terms of the political spectrum in this country to be fighting each other. You got to figure out how to save agriculture generally. You need to be talking to the other 99%, and you need to be figure out how to get along. You know, after all, isn't that what we asking our members in Congress to do? Get along. We want them to make decisions. We want them to forget about whether they're a Democrat or Republican. They're Americans, and we want them to get something done. Well, how's agriculture any different? We need to get along. We need to have a conversation. We need to have dialogue. They may be hard dialogues, may be difficult. The issues may be very complex, but we cannot just have this warring factions in agriculture because it diminishes all of agriculture. And we need to use agriculture's clout more effectively. I say this in this way. We still have the capacity to make a difference. We just don't use it. For example, you got a Secretary of Defense nominee right now. That person, whoever the Secretary of Defense is going to be able to tell Ray Mabus whether he can continue with this Navy biofuel initiative or not. So farmers ought to be very concerned about who the next Secretary of Defense is. I haven't heard any farm group weigh in on that nomination. Now, they'd weigh in on the nomination for Secretary of Ag. Right? You know, they have a lot of opinions about who that ought to be. But this guy has a chance to either kill or promote a huge market. And that would be a way of also educating the rest of the country about the capacity of agriculture and our farmers and ranchers. So we just have to, I think we have to be a lot more creative than we've been. Can I take one more? Okay, one more.
I appreciated your comment about Whole Foods and trying to change the way rules are done, and I also appreciate your comment about Lyndon Johnson. When Johnson proposed and Congress passed in 1965 the first national water quality legislation, in the message that he sent to Congress, he indicated it's going to be relatively easy to improve, or easier to improve the water quality discharges of cities, but very tough to deal with non-point sources, because this basically involves rural areas. And in the last 50 years, the real success has been the Department of Agriculture through your conservation programs and through the efforts for the large-scale agriculture of the animal operations. The challenge right now is in many states we have problems with non-point source pollution. EPA has limited leverage in terms, it's mostly regulatory. Agriculture has the capacity to have positive, not just carrots, not just sticks, but carrots, in terms of conservation and working with farmers. And in Texas, we've got a lot of farmers who are upset because they're facing regulatory demands, and it's not voluntary on their part, and yet they view themselves as the real stewards of the land, and they are. And my question is there some way, it may already be occurring, but can EPA and agriculture work more effectively together to accomplish the goals of improving water quality through enhancing agriculture and the lives of farmers?
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier this notion of regulatory certainty. We're also working with the EPA on the same concept, providing the ability of landowners to know that if you do a certain series of conservation measures, the EPA will basically work with you and deem you in compliance, so that you're not faced with a year later or 2 years later somebody else coming in and saying, well, that's great what you did, but now here are 5 other things you need to do. So regulatory certainty is one thing. Secondly, one thing that's happened in this administration is I think we've improved the communication between EPA and USDA. We have EPA has an ag representative, and that person was probably in my office more than he was in the EPA office. And so by having better communication, we could see red flags before they popped up. So, for example, on the water issues, the EPA was thinking about rules. We said, well, why don't you try guidance? Don't do a rule, because that's basically the hammer comes down and this is what you got to do, and then what's going to happen is people are going to figure out how to get around the rule, or you don't have enough people to enforce the rule. And how about guidance? And then how about if we use that guidance with our conservation resources to encourage, to make it part of the conservation plan, and we incent it. So better communication. I think it's imperative that the EPA administrator actually come out to rural America. Most of these administrators are urban-centered. Lisa Jackson, to her credit, actually visited farms. She actually had regular meetings with farm groups, which we facilitated at USDA. That's got to continue. Now, to Lisa's credit, when she was asked what she regretted most, she said, you know, I regret that I didn't fully appreciate and understand at the beginning how what we were thinking about could be misconstrued by folks in rural areas. That the EPA reputation, if you will, is not particularly good in a lot of rural areas, and that makes it hard for us to have any kind of conversation with farmers because they immediately assume the worst. And a good example was the dust rule, which we tried to convince farmers for 3 years it wasn't going to happen. Couldn't convince them. The spilled milk rule, which is, you know, the cow kicks over the milk pail and somehow there's going to be an EPA person fining you for that. None of that happened, but boy, that sure was out there. So better communication, more creative use of the NRCS programs, regulatory certainty, and then this ecosystem market thing is also an opportunity, because that's private sector money. That's an industry coming in and saying, farmer, you can, through your conservation on your land, you can get a result that I need to satisfy my regulatory responsibility, and it's cheaper for me to pay you than it is, it's cheaper to have green infrastructure, if you will, than gray infrastructure. So I think there's a lot going on in this space. I think there's still a lot of work that has to be done in terms of building a better relationship and a better understanding. You know, oftentimes EPA has to do something because Congress has directed them to do it, or a court has forced them to do it. It's not like these people are sitting in the EPA office building there in Washington D.C. saying, how are we going to monkey with people today in rural America? It's a judge comes down and says, you got to do this. Or Congress says, here are 6 things you got to do, and they got to follow the law. So, well, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Well, on behalf of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you for sharing your insights, perspectives, and vision of the complexities that really attend not just agriculture, but energy and the environment and everything else. Let's give one more hand to the Secretary.